Hello ladies and gentlemen, today we're back in War Thunder and we're doing another comment response. This one comes in from Toshio Akiyama, and you may have seen him before. I've actually done a couple of replays of his work. He's known as Toshio1987 in game, and last week or the week before, on the 6th of August, I did a video on his arcade Tiger play, which was very fun to watch. Especially when a tiger faces jumbos. But he does also have a question, and may I just say, if you do have a question, please leave it in like any comment section. I generally look at all of the comments, I'll screen cap it, and then I'll probably make a video out of it. If I don't do that, well, I'll just reply straight on the spot. But anyway, let's get into it. What's next? How about a discussion of Japanese heavy tanks? I have a Sushi Tiger arcade replay for you. And did I mention that Japan has a total of one tank at 5.7? So let's tackle this in two separate ways. So we'll talk about the 5.7 first, and then we'll get into the heavy tanks. The issue with Japan is the same issue I thought they would have for, well, since their release or even before their release. Unfortunately, because of the way Japanese tank design went in World War II, very much similar to Italian aircraft design, they're gonna have a massive gap at Tier 4, no matter how you slice it. Same with Italy, as we see with the tree that was released. They had to put a BF-109 in to fill it out. Now for the Japanese tree, they went a bit of a different route. They went for the 76 Sherman, the HVSS, and also the Bulldog. So it seems like they're okay with adding vehicles from other nations, as long as those nations kind of, sort of use them. So therefore, the only way you're going to see more 5.7 tanks around for Japan is probably going to have to be German ones, or ones which were used after the war as kind of a defensive force. Now, am I okay with that? No, not really. I would rather just have a zone in the tech tree that there wasn't any tanks. I'm not a person who thinks that every nation should have a tank or an aircraft at every BR. I would rather just stick to what is historically accurate in that sense, but I understand that Gaijin have a different vision from me, and that's completely fair. That means I get to talk about it and lay out, you know, my points on it. So let's get into the heavy tanks. The heavy tanks have been something which a lot of people have been talking about since the Japanese release, because it seems like a lot of people want a light tank line, a heavy tank line, and a medium tank line, basically like every other nation. Or at least when you get to Tier 4 and Tier 5, you have a medium tank line and a heavy tank line. We have seen some other tanks, such as like the Object 906, which have tried to throw in a few light tanks. But generally, if you look at light tanks, they're very spare at Tier 5. I suppose you could kind of class the Leopard as a light tank, but in real life it was seen as a main battle tank and therefore a medium tank. So when we talk about heavy tanks for Japan, there really aren't that many options. To be quite honest, they didn't really need them. If you look at the warfare that happened in the Pacific during World War II, generally what you see is a lot of quite small islands which are easily dominated by infantry, and therefore tanks are, well, they're kind of either a super weapon or just something that gets in the way. If you have an incredibly heavy tank and let's say you're at Guadalcanal, well, it's not really going to be able to go anywhere, is it? And a lot of the islands that the Japanese took with help of their infantry divisions and also their navy and also their aircraft, they weren't really what we would call friendly to tanks. This is why in the Pacific front you saw a lot more light tanks, you know, stuff like the Har-Go and even the Stuarts, which were used in excess by the Americans. And the Americans eventually transitioned into medium tanks such as the Sherman and the like, but you've got to remember that's still not that heavy, especially compared to the Japanese tanks which were thought of and developed. So, yeah, it's kind of as simple as that. Even some of the medium tanks, if you look at, I believe it's the 75mm Japanese tanks, like the Cheeto or the Chinu, whichever ones they are, might be both. A lot of them were kind of kept on the Japanese mainland, if they were built at all, and the reason for that is because they were built late, and also it was seen as the Americans were going to invade, so therefore they would need some kind of tank force. So even a lot of the medium tanks that the Japanese built didn't really get off the island, and as I said, due to the factors before, and I didn't even mention transportation of these things, which obviously is a big factor as well. But first of all, one of the tanks that you could add in, which isn't exactly Japanese, but would be a nice heavy tank which could lead into the French line, is the Renault FT. Now the Renault FT, there was 10 variants of it used by the Japanese, and if you want a link to the forum post that I'm using, and some other posts as well, then I'll leave it in the description for you so you can read it for yourself. But anyway, the Renault FT was a World War I tank, basically. When we look at it, it entered service in 1917, which was basically when tanks were first introduced in World War II in any real capacity. And it looks very primitive. For the time of 1917, it was probably one of the best looking tanks and most functional tanks, which is why it was one of the ones which lasted so long until 1949. But when we look at actual use, it was probably pretty much done for in the 30s when other better tanks started coming around. So there are 10 Renault variants that you could use. They were used in the war between Japan and the Chinese nationalists. So yeah, you could throw them in at tier 1 if you felt like it. Generally, I doubt they're going to go in that direction, just because they'll probably want to save it for the French tree. But it would be quite nice to have it installed in a update, because then it will get people talking about the French tech tree and what they might be able to have. The next one is actually a tank we already have in game. It's the Type 95 heavy tank. This is a premium tank at tier 1. And the prototype version of it was called the Type 91. Now the Type 91 is not that different from the Type 95, so therefore in my mind what we could do is we could put in the Type 91 as a version in the normal tree, and then have the Type 95 as the premium. As I said, there's not really much difference between them. It had 5 crew members, it had a 70mm tank gun, and there was only one of them built, but hey ho, that's never stopped them before. So yeah, if it was up to me, there just wouldn't be any Japanese heavy tanks, but we're talking specifically about what they could put in game. My personal point of view is I don't like prototypes, especially when they had a whole host of issues, which these Japanese tanks had. The only real difference between the Type 91 and the Type 95 is the gun on the front of it was the same, but the smaller gun basically was a machine gun instead of the gun, the 37mm that you see on the premium one that we have in game. That's really the only difference. So that could be a tier 1, 1.3 tank. Even though it was a heavy tank, it was still only about mid 20 tons, and at the time of 1931, yeah, that was pretty heavy. But it's not going to be a world beater, just like the premium one that we have in game is not a world beater at all. It's too big with no armor on it. In 1940, they started heavy tank projects again after the failure of the Type 95 and the Type 91 in 1931. They just decided in 1940 that they wanted something heavy and something powerful to be used against the Soviet Union at the time, which is kind of hilarious. So there was a heavy tank project which was headed by a one Hideo Iwakuro, Iwakuro, and he was a major general in the Imperial Japanese Army. The plan itself was named Super Heavy 100-ton model, and the idea was that it was just going to be bigger and better than anything else that they'd seen at the time. The idea of bigger is better, well, you look at the mouse and you wonder why nobody has taken any concepts from it in modern tank design. Maybe it wasn't as good as they thought. But anyway, So they created a 100-ton tank, and the Imperial Japanese Army called it the Iwakuro 100T, obviously being 100 tons, and the guy who designed it called Hideo Iwakuro, I should say. And there was no type name for it, because to be honest, it didn't really get to that level. And the idea was this 100-ton tank would have a 105mm cannon on it, with 150mm of penetration at 100 meters. And it would also have a 75mm gun on the hull turret. Yeah. They love their double turrets, no idea. They actually produced a prototype of this vehicle, but as usual when it comes to these massive vehicles, it had mechanical issues, and after some trials they just decided, yeah, we'll just scrap this. But if they put it in game, this is a machine which had a 105mm as a main armament and a 75mm as a hull turret, so we're looking at something which will pack a lot of punch. Now if you just give it HE shells, then obviously it won't, but something tells me if you have a 105, they'll probably give it HE and then maybe the 75 AP HE, something like that, just to balance it out, or the 75 will get HE and then the main gun will get something useful. If we look at the one which was actually built, it was given additional armor, and then they actually bolted on extra armor on top of it. I have no idea, maybe they wanted to hit the 100-ton mark. When we look at the hull and turret front, it is slightly angled, and it's 75mm plus a 75mm plate. So you're looking at 150mm on the front of the machine. On the sides, it's 35 plus 35 plate, so 70mm, and on the rear 35 plus 35 plate, so once again 70mm, slightly angled once again. So when we look at a tank like this, you've got a tank with a 105, it's absolutely massive, remember, this is a huge machine, you'll see it from the pictures, with a 75mm in the hull, and also a machine gun, at least one beside it. There is some concept drawings where the machine actually had two 75mm in hull mounted positions, but I'm guessing they would have just stuck one with a machine gun. With 150mm of armor on the front of it. And generally, that would be the front plate. Everywhere else will be different. If we look at the where the turret is, there's probably some extra armor there in the gun mantlet, but there's probably a bit less where the guns are on the hull. So therefore, you know, there will be weak spots on it. So when we look at the 100T, or whatever you want to call it, the Iwakuro 100T, could this actually fit in game? This is a huge tank. If we just look at the wheels of the vehicle, you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. You have 12 road wheels on either side of this thing. And it looks like the tracks themselves would not be able to support the tank, which is probably where some of the mechanical issues came from. But we're talking about a huge beast here, with a massive turret and massive 75mm. Now, one of the issues with adding tanks this large, because you may think that the Type 95 is a big tank, but this would just dwarf it, is the fact that a lot of the maps we have would just not, you wouldn't be able to fit this vehicle on. When you look at stuff like Kuban may be able to get away with it, but stuff like Karelia and Ash River, no way. It wouldn't be able to get up any of the hills for a start, and it would just stick out like a sore thumb. It's pretty obvious to me that the 105mm would not really have that much gun depression, so you would be focusing using your 75mm. And the 105 itself with 150mm of penetration is pretty good, but overall it just doesn't seem like a good tank just because of the size of it. Because of the way that APHE and APC-BC rounds work in this game, once you penetrate that tank, it's going to do so much damage to it that it's just going to be thrown away and completely useless. And obviously, with the fact that it's so big, they can kind of screw with the numbers since it did have mechanical issues, so therefore a top speed was never really sorted out. So they could screw with the acceleration and the top speed and therefore make it quite nippy if they felt like it, but I really doubt they would. But if we look at the base stats, so 150 slightly angled on the front, 105mm cannon with small turrets on the hull. Not really, well, they might be turrets, who knows. Let's just call them turrets with 2 or 1 75mm. The fact that it pens 150mm puts it at a solid, maybe tier 3, and its armor with 150mm, well, there's quite a lot of vehicles at tier 3 which wouldn't be able to penetrate that. So this may be a tier 4 vehicle if they decided to add it in the game. The 105mm, as long as they give it the right ammunition, if they give it some kind of APHE, it will obviously have a long reload. Just because that's how you balance something like this. You could sit it in tier 4 and it could sit kind of pretty. There is a lot of angles on it where shells could bounce off, and therefore you could see the armor being a lot more beneficial than just the 150mm that is sat there. Obviously, there are still areas of weakness, so therefore you could take it on, but you could put this thing up against, 76 Shermans, and it probably would do quite well. The issue is getting that gun on target. Well, a lot of people are going to be able to shoot you before you see them. So therefore, would it be useful? Maybe not. But it's something that you could realistically add in the game if you felt like it. It's a sad state of affairs, because when you have something with a lot of armor and a big gun, it's really ripe for abuse in a game like War Thunder, because all they have to do is make it a little bit nippy, and then you've got a complete master machine. One of the biggest issues, in my opinion, in War Thunder is the vehicles which were either planned or never really built and just have some rough averages of what they might have been. An example of this is the R2Y2, probably my personal most hated plane in War Thunder, because it just never existed. The R2Y1 existed, which actually had propellers, but the R2Y2, or maybe the R1Y1 I'm thinking of, but anyway, the R2Y2 just is a complete work of fiction. And at least the 100T isn't a complete work of fiction, but it has enough information missing from it that you could abuse it to make it useful in a game. And if some people are okay with that, then go for it. But in my personal opinion, I'm not really okay with that. And that is one of my main issues with a lot of these Japanese heavy tanks. So now we go into the even more bizarre. We have the OIs. Now this is probably the tanks that people have been clamoring for a very long time. This seems to be the one that people cling to as something that will eventually be added, and it probably will be in either some special vehicle or premium form, because if you just have this tank and as a heavy tank tree, it doesn't really work too well. But anyway, so Irakuro was not the only guy who decided to create heavy tanks for Japan, but he was one with the crazy ideas, let's say. So he decided that 100 tons was just not enough for him. He didn't feel like it, you know? So therefore, he went on to create the OI series. Now, OI, in Japanese, or at least this was the meaning of it at the time, was supposed to mean big or heavy, so big one or heavy one, which is kind of interesting. But they weren't ever given a type name, once again, because they never really entered service or even really got past the prototype stage. So, because type basically meant mass production. Now, that can be stretched a little bit, as we see with certain Japanese tanks, but overall that was the general rule. So therefore, when it came to the OIs, or any really heavy tanks that the Japanese had, they weren't mass-produced, so calling them type would be kind of silly. So after the 100T, or the Iwakuro 100T, he decided to follow up with an OI 100T, and you'll see some pictures here of the OI 100T. And the idea was that it was just going to be bigger than the 100T. You can see that the turret is absolutely massive, but the general design is very similar. And then what it would have in it was once again the 105mm cannon, but a slightly better one. It had better penetration over range, and also it had two multi-purpose chassis turrets, and with a single 57mm. So the whole, the guns on this thing, the main guns that we actually care about, is a 105mm and two 57mm in the hull, on little turrets. There was only one prototype built, of course, because that seems to be the way with these. You'd think they'd give up by now, but nope. It actually sunk into the ground on testing trials, which is kind of hilarious. And this actually happened due to the crazy weather that they had in the region during the trials. So comparing this with the 100T that we had before, the Iwakuro, the tanks are very, very similar. The only real difference is how the armor was constructed, and also the OI had a bit more power to weight. So obviously this one didn't last long. I mean, during testing it sank. Not really down to its faults, kind of like with the I-185, where it had some engine issues, but they decided it was a really good fighter, but they'd already decided to produce the Axe and the Levechkins, so changing lines to produce the I-185s was just not really possible. But this, the fact that this sunk into the ground is just, it's hilarious irony. But it's another tank which, you know, basically the same armor, same guns. You could put it around the BR of the 100T. I mean, if you really think about it, I think it would sit around 5.7. I mean, 150mm isn't a lot at 5.7, especially when we're talking about machines which would have a lot of weak spots, especially in their turrets. So yeah, I think 5.7 around there, maybe even 5.0 if you felt like it. It really depends on how good you make the 105mm. But anyway, so obviously for the OI 100T that was halted, and the other 100T was also halted. But they decided to make more OI variants, because why not? These first two didn't work out, the Type 95 didn't really work out, but who cares, we'll just keep going. So they made two more super heavy modifications of the OI, the 120T and the 130T. Now, guess how heavy the 120T is? That's right, it was 120 tons, and, well, the 130? Well, guess what, it was 130 tons. Why not just make them bigger? My god. So these projects actually began mid-war, so we're talking 1943 to 1944. So these didn't really have a chance to ever really be produced. By the time 1944 rolled around, the Japanese were definitely on the retreat and struggling for supplies, which is why we didn't really see any jets out of them, even though they got a lot of the technology from the Germans to create them. But if we're talking hypothetically, these tanks had 200mm of frontal armor and 150mm on the sides, and also massive tracks, just like the 100Ts. So if you're worried about your shots getting eaten by Panthers tracks, by T-34 tracks, well, I've got a new world for you. It's called the 130T, 100T, and 120T. Your rounds are going to get eaten all day long, boyo, and you're gonna like it. But anyway, 200mm of frontal armor, slightly sloped. I mean, that's pretty good. The issue is, unlike the 100T had a pretty big gun mantlet, which covered a lot of the front of the turret. These OIs have incredibly flat turrets, or at least flat parts which you could shoot, so it's going to be a base 200mm. But anyway, they both had the Type 92 100mm cannon, which is pretty good. It could fire up to 1800 200 meters, or at least that's what it was recorded as. Fire velocity 765 meters per second, which is pretty good for a large gun. And it was able to penetrate 105mm of penetration at 1000 meters. So, not too bad on the penetration front. But what we're talking about here is basically a KV-2 gun, if we're being serious about it. The 130T OI was actually recorded at a speed of around 25 to 35 kilometers, but of course, due to mechanical breakdowns, the Japanese couldn't afford to continue production. Who's surprised here? Not me. The 120T's background is shady. It was recorded as being constructed, however before the parts were assembled they were sent to Manchukuo. What happened after is unknown. There could be a ghost 120T wandering around, so just watch out for that. But because we know that the 130T survived and was actually, field tested, then we can make some base assumptions on the 120T. We do also have some drawings of the 120T as well. What is kind of interesting is on the 120T, the gun actually looks a lot larger on the base drawings than the 130T. But that could be just down to the fact that the 130T was absolutely huge. We're talking about a vehicle which is 10 meters long, 4 meters high. Completely ridiculous when you think about it. And once again, large tracks, large engine, large turrets, and with 150mm even on the side, you're going to have to put this thing maybe 6.0, 6.7, probably 6.7 to deal with the big boys. I mean, you've got the T-29 there, the Tiger 2H SLAR, you've got the RU-251, what do the Russians have? IS-6 at 7.0, IS-2s at 5.7, IS-2 Mod 4460, I think. The British, obviously the Carnarvon, the Struve, and the Centurion Mark III with their Sabo, they can pen well over 200mm. So actually you might be able to get away with putting this at 5.7, 6.0, something like that, and then the other one's 5.3, 5.7. A lot of these tanks are incredibly similar for what they are. I mean, you're talking about a large gun, and the armor. I mean, the armor, I suppose, is different. I mean, you're adding 50mm, but generally at that tier, even 200mm isn't that great. People figure out where to shoot you really quickly. So, the 130T and the 120T, they could be added to the game. Once again, my opinion on all of these tanks is I hope they are never added, but what do I know, What do I know? They'll probably get added at some point. The question is what ammunition they will use. When we look at a lot of multi-turreted tanks in the game, the Churchill Mark 1, the Lee, the Grant, I mean there are others but I can't think of them right now. One of the, even the M6A1, the interesting thing is that depending on the vehicle, some of the guns are actually not too bad. The M6A1 with its 76 and its 45, if you get down tiered against Panzer IVs, you can actually pen the front of a Panzer IV with the M6's 45mm. When we look at the M3 Lee or the Grant, the 37mm is pretty useful, and the 75mm is not as useful, but it still does a decent job. If we look at the Churchill Mark 1, well, the 75 is completely useless, and you have to hope that the 40mm does some work. But the majority of the time, you're looking at your armor and hoping for the best. So therefore, we do have a bit of a mixed bag when it comes to these multi-turreted machines. There are others, but those are the main ones I can think of right now. So what I envision when we look at all of these tanks, because these are basically the main tanks that a lot of people talk about. So there are a few others which we will get into, which could be added, but they're even more down the line than something like this. But anyway, what I see is decent armor, terrible engines, and a pretty good gun. And the gun itself is what's going to sell these tanks, or what is going to break these tanks. There's a lot of machines in game which have pretty decent armor, but they can't really back it up with the gun. There are only a few which are able to back it up. The T10M, the Jumbo, the 75 Jumbo because it got its BR reduced, and also it has APCR to deal with Tigers. I mean, I like the Churchill Mark 1, but I know a lot of people don't, so I won't bring that up. But the early KV-1s have a chance as well. But every other heavy tank in the game really struggles against its medium tank counterparts. and that's mainly down to a lot of factors I've talked about before. If you want to see my opinions on it, go and watch the Hegemony of Medium Tanks video that I made a while back. So all of these vehicles have big ass guns on them. It's going to depend on how accurate they are, if they're going to have to rely on adjustment of fire. Obviously these tanks are going to be absolutely huge, and the crew sizes of them isn't that large. So therefore, they're going to take a lot of hits. If you put them at a BR, which they are able to take a lot of hits, then, you know, we'll be doing okay. But if you put them at a BR where their armor is butter, if you basically balance them by their gun, they're going to be useless. Just like we see with stuff like the Matilda, right? But if you decide to try and balance them with armor, if you make their gun a pretty slow reload, we may have an opportunity to have an interesting heavy tank line, even though they are all not even really prototypes, but test vehicles. So, if they do that, then there's a possibility of them being functional and good, even though they're going to be incredibly slow, even though their secondary guns are going to be pretty useless. Depending on what they give the main gun, the 100mm gun or the 105mm gun, if they give it something like APHG, then we're talking. Then we're looking at a gun which will do a lot. Or maybe even if they design it like they do the KV-2 gun, where the KV-2, even with its HE shell, can do quite a lot of damage. Maybe they design it as a faux artillery strike, and the idea is if you hit a vehicle, it's going to blow off the tracks, destroy the cannon, basically leave it out of action for a while until one of your teammates pops up and like shoots it. Maybe that's the way to go with these machines. Use them as like disabling machines. But all of them, I could safely put them from like 5.0 to 6.0, and I think that all fit pretty well. And then have the Type 91 at 1.3 or 1.7, probably 1.3, but it doesn't it doesn't really make a difference at that BR. To be honest, you're always going to be put in low games. The last heavy tank that we're going to talk about is not really anything. This is something in 1945 where they decided, as a defensive position on the Japanese mainland, they were going to try and create a last heavy tank, a 2-engine super heavy tank, which was going to be larger than the OI, being 5 meters tall, where the OI was only 4 meters tall. And it was actually given a title, which is weird. It was called the Type 206. And this tank was partially built, and the idea was it was just going to be a gun platform for the 140mm warship gun. But by the time the turret and the gun were formed together, the project was just stopped, and, you know, nothing really happened from it. It was used as a defensive position on one of the Pacific Islands, very similar to how, you know, you would have a panther in the middle of a city and you would actually build rubble around it, or maybe just take the turret top off, leave it as it is, not able to move, but it was able to hold the streets. You know, some stuff like that did happen in places like Berlin. This was basically a very similar one. So if they were feeling inclined, they could add in some kind of monstrosity, which would be incredibly tall, and have a 140mm warship gun on it. It's very odd that it actually was given a type name, since, you know, according to the Japanese themselves, that was designated for vehicles which were mass-produced. But I'm guessing at that time of 1945 they were a bit desperate, and they just didn't really think about it. So that could be something that you put in, but who knows? If you want a comparison for some pictures, I would, comparing like the size of these vehicles, I would say go to the link in the description, because it does have some really beautiful drawings of how big these guys were. If you want to look at the Type 95, the Type 95 is as tall and nearly as long as the T-28. The OI itself, the 100T variant, was actually as big as the T-39, if you know what that monster is, which we will eventually see, I'm sure. If you want to know about the OI 120, well, you know we have the T-34 in game. It's about half a meter taller than that, and also a good maybe meter or two longer. The KV-5 is quite close to it. I'm sure we'll see that one day. But yeah, click on the link, go to the bottom and see the pictures, because they're really interesting. So yeah, these are the heavy tanks that you could put in the game. They're all going to stick around 5.0 to maybe 6.7, depending on how good the gun is. But my personal opinion is there is no need for these. When they started announcing the Japanese tech tree, the Italian tech tree, the French tech tree, I knew that there were going to be gaps in them. And there should be, because there were literally parts of the war, or, you know, the majority of the war, where nothing was really made. And you would have to hope on prototypes. I've been doing a lot of research on the French tech tree, and the majority of planes which the French made were prototypes during the war, which were basically the ones which you could see theoretically in the game. They had a lot of 1930s aircraft, did the French, but they didn't really have a lot of aircraft which would deal with that tier 3, tier 4 area where a lot of these nations run into problems. These heavies could help you out in that tier 3, 4 area, but is it a solution that could be used and would be effective? Maybe. Is it a solution I agree with? No. I really don't agree with that solution. I don't think it's a good idea to put these massive tanks in just because either some people want them or because it fills a gap. I don't like that idea. But I understand a lot of people disagree with that. It's definitely a personal point of view. The last machine, or machines, I'd like to talk about is something which is slightly different. You may know that the Type 95 was not just a tank, it actually had some variants based off of it, and they were SPGs. We had an experimental 105mm SPG, the Giro, or the Giro Sha, and then we had an experimental 150mm SPG, the Hero Sha, or the Hero Sha, depending on how you wanted to say it. And so, basically what they did is they took the Type 95 hull, took the turret off, and put a massive stonking gun on it, either a 105mm or a 150mm. Now, they wouldn't be very useful in War Thunder. I mean, you have okay armor, I suppose, if you look like tier 2. But then I started thinking, well, they did just add the Sturmpanzer II to the game, and this is basically a bigger Japanese Sturmpanzer. And it may be a way of testing out the 105mm that you'd want to put on some of their super heavies if you decided to put them in game. And we already have the chassis in game, so you know it wouldn't be too hard to put this in. But yeah, two SPGs with a 105 and a 150 on it, I think that would be kind of fun. But yeah, that's my opinion on Japanese heavy tanks. Will we see them, like from Gaijin? My answer is probably yes. Do I want to see them? No, I don't. There is not enough information on them. There is not enough ground there for the tanks themselves to sit on without being able to screw with the numbers. And after stuff like the R2Y2, I am not a fan of that. I just really aren't. It's an unfortunate thing. I know a lot of people want them, and you know, they'll probably get their wish. I'll probably bitch about them closer to the time when they'll be released. But first of all, I'll have to see some devlogs on them, see what they have to say about these tanks, instead of what I would speculate them saying. But anyway, I hope you all have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next time.